I bought 1,500 acres of land that nobody wanted. No neighbors, no road, no drama, just timber, creek water, and silence. Then one morning, I drove out to the property and found a woman standing on my bridge. Clipboard, two guys behind her. The kind of posture that says, I own this conversation. She introduced herself as Diane Kellner, president of the Ashford Pines HOA, said the bridge belonged to the community. Had a document ready for me to sign. Permanent access rights, no compensation, no expiration, like it was already decided and I was just there to make it official. I read it, all of it. Then I handed it back. She looked at me like nobody had ever done that before. Here's the thing about Diane, about this entire HOA. They'd been using that bridge for 20 years. But using something and owning something are two very different things, and I had the deed to prove it. My name is Marcus Hale, and I want to be clear about something before this story goes any further. I am not a developer. I'm not a flipper. I don't build subdivisions, or put up storage units, or turn farmland into parking lots. What I do is read deeds, plats, title chains, zoning histories, bankruptcy filings, county GIS records. I find land that's been overlooked, not because it lacks value, but because the people who could have bought it didn't do the paperwork. That's my whole business. That's always been my whole business. I grew up watching my family lose land, the same way most people do. Not to bad luck, but to ignorance. A signature here, a handshake there, a deal that seemed fine, until someone who actually read the document explained what it really said. By the time I was old enough to understand what had happened, it was already gone. That kind of loss doesn't leave you. It just quietly turns into obsession. So, no, Marcus Hale does not have a corporate fund behind him. No partners, no investors, personal savings, one private loan, and a filing system that my wife calls a mental illness. This 1,500-acre parcel was the biggest single bet I had ever placed in my life. I found it on a state land auction listing. Unusually low, because on paper it looked landlocked. Wilderness preserve on 3 sides, and HOA subdivision on the 4th. No obvious road in. Most buyers glanced at the map and moved on. I didn't move on. I spent 6 months in that listing before I bid a single dollar. County GIS maps, old surveying plats from the 80s and 90s, deed records going back to the original timber company that cleared this land in the late 1980s. And what I found buried in a 1994 deed amendment, one paragraph, easy to miss, was a bridge, a single-lane crossing built in 1991 over Ridger-Craftift Creek. Built by the logging company, deed to the parcel, not to the county, not to any easement holder, to the land itself. The HOA on the other side had been using that bridge as their primary exit for 20 years. They painted the guardrails, patched the deck boards, treated it like theirs. They just never checked if it was. I didn't buy this land to fight anybody, but I knew what I owned, and eventually, so did they. The first time I walked this property as its legal owner, it was early November, 5:30 in the morning, the kind of cold that doesn't announce itself. It just settles into your jacket and stays there. I parked at the bridge and walked in on foot. No ATV, no crew, just me and a flashlight and 1,500 acres of land that had been sitting untouched for over 2 decades. The smell hit me first. Pine resin and creek mud and something older underneath. Decomposed timber, wet earth, the kind of smell that tells you a forest has been doing its work without anyone watching. Ridger Creek was running low that time of year, but you could hear it the whole way in, that steady and different sound of water that doesn't care who owns the deed. I had studied this land for 6 months, on paper, maps, plats, satellite imagery, soil surveys, but walking it is different. Paper tells you what's there. Walking tells you what it's worth. The timber stands were better than I expected. Mature hardwood, oak, hickory, some popple on the eastern third of the parcel. A 25-year rotation harvest managed right would generate real income, not retirement money. Working money, the kind that pays loans and justifies risk. The old quarry was on the western edge. Decommissioned in the early 90s, the crater had been slowly filling with groundwater and rainfall for 30 years. By the time I bought the land, it had cleared into something that looked less like an industrial wound and more like a natural pond. Ducks were already using it. I stood at the edge of it that first morning and thought, hunting leases, 8 clients at $4,000 a season, that's $32,000 a year, from a hole in the ground that nobody wanted. The creek frontage ran for nearly a mile along the southern boundary. Conservation easement potential. The state DNR had been quietly expanding a wildlife corridor program in this county. 600 acres of protected land could mean a significant tax benefit and a long-term partnership that cost me nothing but a signature. This land had been written off because it looked inaccessible. 3 sides bordered by wilderness preserve, the 4th by a subdivision. No county road. The logging company that built this place went bankrupt in 1999. The parcel passed through a creditor bank, then a failed conservation trust, then the state land authority. For 23 years, it sat in administrative limbo while the timber grew and the quarry cleared and the creek kept running. I bought it for $612,000 at state auction. Nobody else bid, not a single competing offer, because nobody else read the 1994 deed amendment. I knew about the HOA before I ever set foot on the property. Ashford Pines. 200 homes built in the early 1990s on the eastern edge of what used to be the logging company's access corridor. Nice enough neighborhood, maintained lawns, matching mailboxes, the kind of place where the street signs are pressure washed twice a year. I had driven through it during my research phase just to get a feel for the adjacent community. I didn't think much of it. My land was outside their subdivision boundary, outside their jurisdiction, outside their world as far as I was concerned. Then I heard the name Diane Kellner. A series of formal objections filed against a proposed cellular tower near the Wilderness Preserve boundary. Detailed, aggressive, well-organized objections. Whoever wrote them knew how to navigate bureaucratic process. I made a note and moved on. Then I saw the name again in HOA meeting minutes I pulled as part of my title research. 9 consecutive years as board president. The minutes read like transcripts from a small municipal government. Paint color approvals, noise ordinance citations, a formal declaration that a resident's raised vegetable garden constituted a visible nuisance under Section 4.2 of the CCNRs. I remember reading that last one twice. A vegetable garden, a formal declaration. I started to understand what kind of person I was going to be neighbors with. Diane Kellner was in her late 50s. Pristine presentation, the kind of woman whose manicure never chips, and whose casual wear looks like it was pressed that morning. In Ashford Pines, she was not just the HOA president. She was the final word on everything that happened within those boundaries. She had cultivated over 9 years an authority that had stopped feeling like a volunteer position and started feeling like an appointment. The board beneath her was 2 neighbors, a retired accountant named Greg and a part-time real estate agent named Linda, who voted with Diane on everything and had, as far as I could tell from the minutes, never once pushed back on a single decision. The CCNRs governing Ashford Pines were old, written in 1992, amended twice in the mid-90s, largely untouched since. I had read them during my research, not because they applied to my land, which they didn't, but because I wanted to understand the legal landscape around my property. What I found was a document full of gaps, vague language, undefined terms, the kind of CCNRs that work fine as long as nobody ever challenges them. Nobody in Ashford Pines had ever challenged them. I wasn't planning to either. I just needed to know what I was working next to. For 20 years, the residents of Ashford Pines had driven across my bridge every single day without knowing it was mine. There was a back road, a county-maintained gravel track that connected the subdivision to the highway from the north. Unpaved, seasonal. It added 11 miles to the commute and turned to mud in the spring. Nobody used it unless they had to. The bridge over Richcraftoft Creek was their road, the real one. Groceries, school runs, work commutes, emergency vehicles, everything that connected Ashford Pines to the rest of the county crossed that single-lane bridge every morning and every evening. The HOA had maintained it informally over the years, patched the deck boards when they started to rot, painted the guardrails, replaced the reflective signage when it faded. They had a line item in their annual budget labeled bridge maintenance, $1,200 a year, every year going back at least a decade. I found it in the HOA financial disclosures that were part of the public record. They believed that maintenance established their right to the bridge, that 20 years of use and upkeep had made it theirs in some meaningful legal sense. It hadn't. And here's why that matters. In most U.S. states, to claim ownership of someone else's property through what's called adverse possession, you have to meet a very specific legal standard. The use has to be open, continuous, exclusive, and hostile, and it has to run for a statutory period, typically between 10 and 21 years, depending on the state. More importantly, if the true owner was genuinely unaware of the use, as happens frequently with parcels that pass through bankruptcy estates and sit in administrative limbo for decades, courts routinely reject adverse possession claims. You can maintain a bridge for 20 years. You can paint it and patch it and budget for it. None of that transfers a deed. Diane Kellner didn't know that. Her attorney, as I would eventually discover, hadn't told her. I want to be honest about what was at stake for me personally, because this story only makes sense if you understand what losing would have meant. The private loan I used to fund this purchase had a 3-year performance clause. That meant I had 36 months to demonstrate that the land was generating income. Timber leases, hunting operations, conservation easement proceeds, or the lender had the right to call the note. Default on a $380,000 loan secured by a parcel I just bought with no other major assets behind it. Every income stream I had planned for this land required bridge access. Timber crews need to move equipment. Hunting lease clients need to drive in. Conservation assessors need to walk the acreage. Without the bridge, the back road was the only option. 11 miles of mud and gravel that no timber company would commit to, and no hunting client would pay premium rates to endure. If Diane Kellner succeeded in claiming that bridge through legal pressure, through adverse possession, through a court-ordered easement, through any mechanism at all, my business plan collapsed. Not metaphorically, literally. The numbers stopped working. That was my stake. Diane's stake was different. She didn't need the bridge the way I did. Ashford Pines already used it. What she wanted was control. A permanent easement or a deed transfer would have cemented her legacy. The president who secured the community's access forever. It would have given the HOA leverage over every future use of the adjacent land. It would have meant that whatever Marcus Hale planned to do with those 1,500 acres, he would have to come to Diane Kellner first and ask permission. She assumed I didn't know what I bought. She assumed wrong. 3 weeks after closing, I was walking my southern property line with a GPS unit and a notepad marking timber stand boundaries when I saw them. 3 people standing on my side of the bridge. Diane Kellner, I recognized from the HOA meeting photos I'd pulled during research. Late 50s, dark blazer. Clipboard pressed against her chest like a shield. 2 men flanking her, one in a polo shirt, one in khakis, neither of whom looked like they spent much time outdoors. They were standing at the bridge approach on my land, with the casual confidence of people who had never once considered that they might not belong there. I walked toward them slowly. No rush. I wanted to see how long it took before one of them looked uncomfortable. Diane didn't look uncomfortable. She smiled the way people smile when they think they're about to close a deal. She introduced herself, told me she represented the Ashford Pines Homeowners Association, said she was glad we finally had a chance to meet, that the community had been looking forward to getting acquainted with the new landowner, that she hoped we could start things off on the right foot. Then she held out the document. It was a pre-drafted agreement. 4 pages, clean formatting, a signature line at the bottom already labeled with my name. Community Access Agreement across the top in bold. Permanent right-of-way for Ashford Pines' residents across the bridge and the access road in perpetuity. No compensation to me, no expiration clause, no provisions for renegotiation under any circumstance. I read every word, standing right there in the cold, while Diane waited with that smile. Then I took out my phone and photographed every page. Then I handed it back. The smile didn't disappear immediately. It took a second, like a signal traveling a long distance, before it arrived. "Mr. Hale," she said, "this bridge has been used by this community for 20 years. I don't think you fully understand what you're dealing with." I looked at her for a moment before I answered. "I understand exactly what I'm dealing with," I said. "That's why I bought it." She held my gaze for 3 seconds. Then she turned and walked back across the bridge, her 2 associates falling in behind her. She didn't say another word, but I noticed before she reached the other side that she stopped and took photographs of the bridge, the deck, the supports. The approach road on my side. The machine was starting. I drove home that evening and called my attorney to give him a heads up. Not to file anything, just to make sure someone else knew what had happened and when. 14 days later, a certified letter arrived from a law firm I didn't recognize. The firm represented the Ashford Pines Homeowners Association. The letter was 3 pages, formal, and open with the kind of confident legal language designed to make the recipient feel like they've already lost. It asserted that the bridge and its approach road fell within a community easement corridor established in the original 1993 HOA plat map. It demanded that I cease any activity near the bridge that might interfere with established community access rights. It suggested in carefully worded language that stopped just short of a direct threat that failure to execute a right-of-way agreement would result in legal action to formalize the easement through the courts. I read it twice. Then I pulled the 1993 HOA plat map from my files. I had a copy because I had pulled every document associated with this property during my 6 months of research. The community easement corridor referenced in the letter was a utility line easement on the northwestern corner of the HOA's own subdivision. It had nothing to do with the bridge. It wasn't near the bridge. It didn't reference the bridge in any way. The attorney who wrote that letter had either never looked at the plat map himself, or he had looked at it and decided I probably hadn't. That was the first moment I understood exactly what kind of fight this was going to be. Within the same week, the HOA filed a formal complaint with the county planning department. The complaint alleged that I was conducting commercial operations without a permit in proximity to a residential area. Specifically, a truck parked near the bridge approach, while a timber survey crew worked the adjacent stand, and equipment staged on the creek bank for an environmental assessment. None of this required a permit. None of it was subject to HOA oversight. My land was entirely outside the Ashford Pines subdivision boundary, which meant it was entirely outside the HOA's legal jurisdiction. Not partially outside, not ambiguously outside, completely unambiguously outside. The county planning department opened an investigation anyway because when a formal complaint comes in, they have to. An inspector came out, walked the site, reviewed my permits and survey authorizations, and closed the complaint 11 days later with no findings. But here's what that complaint actually accomplished. Not legally, but practically. It put my property address into the county planning system as a flagged location. It created a paper trail that made my land look like a problem. And it gave Diane something to tell her community. "We've already filed with the county. The authorities are involved. We're handling this." She was building a narrative, and I was the villain in it. I want to be clear about something. I understand HOA jurisdiction law. I understood it then. And HOA's authority, its ability to fine, regulate, cite, or govern, extends only to properties within its recorded subdivision plat. I was not within that plat. I was not a member of Ashford Pines. I had never signed their CCNRs. They had exactly zero legal authority over my land, my operations, or my decisions. What they were doing wasn't enforcement. It was harassment, with a letterhead. I started hearing from neighbors within about 2 weeks of the planning complaint. Some of the calls were sympathetic. A few Ashford Pines residents who had looked up the deed records themselves and felt uncomfortable with what Diane was doing in their name. Those calls were short, cautious, always ending with some version of, "I can't really get involved, but I wanted you to know." Most of the other contact was less friendly. I had people slow roll past my gate on the county road. I had someone leave a note on my truck windshield, parked legally on a public easement that said, "Developers not welcome." I wasn't a developer. I had never been a developer. But Diane had told her community I was planning to build a commercial truck depot on the land. And in the absence of any other information, people believed her. There was a man named Walt, retired surveyor, lived on the eastern edge of Ashford Pines, in a house that backed up almost to my property line. He had introduced himself to me a few weeks after I bought the land. Friendly, genuinely curious about what I was planning to do with the acreage. He knew the land, had actually walked parts of it years ago doing survey work for the county. We had 2 or 3 good conversations. Then the conversation stopped. I found out later, much later, that Diane had approached Walt privately. He had a variance request pending with the HOA board for a backyard structure. Nothing significant, a small workshop, well within the setback requirements. Diane told him that the board's willingness to approve that variance would depend on how involved he chose to get with the situation next door. Walt backed away. I understood it. He had a pending request and a fixed income, and no appetite for a fight that wasn't his. I didn't hold it against him then. I still don't. But I felt it. That's the thing about this kind of campaign. It's not just legal pressure. It's social pressure. It's being made into a problem in a community you don't even belong to. Watching people you thought might be allies calculate their own risk and quietly step back. There's a particular loneliness to that. Not dramatic, just quiet and heavy and persistent. I drove to the property more than I needed to during those weeks. Walked the timber stands, sat by the creek, reminded myself what I was actually fighting for. The call I had been dreading came on a Wednesday afternoon in late January. My private lender, calm voice, careful language. Someone had filed a notice of interest on my property at the county recorder's office. Had I been informed? Was there a title dispute I hadn't disclosed? A notice of interest, sometimes called a lis pendens in different contexts, is a legal instrument that announces to the world that a third party believes they have a claim on a piece of real property. It doesn't prove anything. It doesn't establish any rights. What it does is attach itself to the public record of the property and make every lender, every future buyer, every title insurance company pause and ask questions. It clouds the title. That's its entire purpose when used in bad faith. Not to assert a valid legal claim, but to create friction, to make the property harder to finance, harder to sell, harder to use as collateral, to turn a clean deed into a question mark. The notice had been filed by the HOA's attorney, without, as I would later discover in deposition, any factual basis for an actual legal claim. His word for it, under oath, was preventative. I sat in my truck, in the parking lot of a gas station, and did the math. I had a 3-year performance clause on my loan. A clouded title meant my lender could classify the asset as encumbered. An encumbered asset changed the terms of the loan. Changed terms could trigger a review. A review at this stage, before the land was generating $1 of income, was not something I could afford to have go sideways. I was not afraid, but I was calculating, and the numbers were tight. And for the first time since I'd signed that auction bid, I felt the weight of how much I had put on this. I drove out to the property that evening, parked at the bridge, sat there in the dark, listening to Riddage Creek run beneath me. The boards held steady under the truck's weight, solid, unhurried, indifferent to all of it. I didn't come this far to hand it over. The camera was mounted on a fence post 12 feet from the bridge approach. On my land, I almost walked past it. It was positioned low, maybe 4 feet off the ground, and angled upward toward the bridge deck and the access road. Commercial-grade, weatherproof housing. The kind of equipment you buy when you want footage that will hold up. I stopped, crouched down, looked at it without touching it. It wasn't a county road camera. I knew what those looked like, and this wasn't one. It wasn't part of any wildlife survey. I would have been notified. The mounting hardware was fresh. The post it was attached to was on my side of the property line. Whoever installed it had walked onto my land to do it. I photographed it from 6 angles, logged the GPS coordinates, noted the GPS coordinates, noted the date and time, then I left it exactly where it was. Back home, I traced the serial number through the manufacturer's registration system. The camera had been purchased through a commercial account. The HOA's property management company bought 8 weeks earlier. 3 weeks before, Diane Kellner showed up on my bridge with her clipboard. She hadn't come to negotiate, she had come to assess. And when I said no, she decided to keep watching. Here is what she didn't know. In this state, and in most states across the country, placing a surveillance device on another person's private property without their knowledge or consent is not a civil matter. It is a criminal offense. The installation itself constitutes criminal trespass. The act of recording constitutes unlawful surveillance. The statute carries felony-level exposure, Class D in our jurisdiction, with civil liability on top, statutory damages, attorney's fees, the works. I called my attorney the next morning, not to report it yet, to understand exactly what I had. He listened to everything. The fake easement letter, the planning complaint, the notice of interest, the camera. He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "Marcus, they've handed you a loaded weapon. The question is when you want to fire it." I told him I wasn't ready yet. I wanted to see how far she would go. I didn't have to wait long. Walt called me on a Thursday evening, voice low like he was worried someone might hear him through the phone. The HOA had called a community-wide meeting for the following Tuesday. I was not invited. Not that I had any expectation of being, but Walt had decided quietly that he was going to go, and that he was going to bring his phone. He called me afterward. Diane had stood at the front of the Ashford Pines' community room for 45 minutes and delivered what Walt described as the most polished piece of misinformation he had ever witnessed in person. She had a presentation, printed handouts, a 1-page legal analysis authored by the HOA attorney summarizing a doctrine she called community necessity. The idea that a residential community's long-standing reliance on an access route created an implied legal right to that route, regardless of the underlying deed. She proposed a special assessment, $800 per household, collected immediately to fund litigation against me to reclaim the bridge. Toward the back of the room, a woman named Patricia raised her hand. Retired paralegal. She asked to see the actual deed documentation supporting the HOA's ownership claim. Diane said the documentation was being prepared. Patricia asked what that meant. Was there a deed or wasn't there? Diane said they were working with counsel to establish the full scope of the community's rights. Patricia sat down, but she didn't stop watching. The assessment passed, 34 votes yes, 12 no, $160,000 authorized in a single evening to fight a legal battle built on a foundation that didn't exist. Walt's recording caught all of it, including the part near the end where Diane told the room that I was a speculator trying to extort this community, and that legal action will resolve this quickly. A speculator trying to extort the community on tape in front of 46 people. I listened to that recording 3 times. Then I called my attorney and told him I was ready. I want to tell you something about the moment you decide to stop being patient. It doesn't feel like anger. It doesn't feel like triumph. It feels like clarity. Like a fog you've been standing in for months finally lifts, and you can see exactly where you are and exactly what you need to do next. I sat at my kitchen table on a Sunday night in early February with every document I had collected since the day Diane Counter walked onto my bridge. The fake easement letter, the planning complaint and its closure, the HOA plat map that proved their attorney had never looked at it, the notice of interest, and the deposition-ready admission that it had been filed without factual basis. The GPS document and surveillance camera purchased on the HOA management account, and Walt's recording. 45 minutes of a community being misled by their own president, including 32 words of clean, unambiguous defamation delivered in front of 46 witnesses. I laid it all out, organized it by date, read through it start to finish like I was reading someone else's story. Then I called my attorney and told him to file. The civil complaint we submitted to County Circuit Court 6 weeks after that community meeting ran 34 pages. 5 counts. Count 1, slander per se and defamation. Diane's recorded statement that I was a speculator trying to extort this community. Made publicly, made falsely, made to a room full of people who then voted to spend $160,000 based partly on that characterization. Count 2, tortious interference with property rights, the fake violation citations, the baseless planning complaint, the manufactured legal threats designed to disrupt my lawful use of my own land. Count 3, unlawful surveillance and criminal trespass, the camera on my property, purchased on the HOA's account, installed without my consent or knowledge. Count 4, abuse of process, the notice of interest filed by the HOA attorney against my title, his own deposition admission that it was filed preventatively without a factual basis for an actual legal claim. Count 5, quiet title, a formal court action to establish permanently and on the public record that the bridge over Ridgercraftoft Creek was my property. Not implied, not argued, settled. The HOA attorney received service on a Thursday morning. My attorney told me he went silent for 11 days. No letters, no calls, no certified mail. 11 days of silence from a man who had been sending aggressive correspondence every 2 weeks for 4 months. I also filed a formal criminal complaint with the county sheriff's office regarding the surveillance camera. Under state statute, unlawful installation of a recording device on private property without consent is a Class D felony. Not a misdemeanor, not a civil infraction, a felony. I submitted the photographs, the GPS coordinates, the serial number trace, and the purchase records linking the camera to the HOA management account. The sheriff's office opened an investigation the same week. There is a phase in civil litigation called discovery. It's the part where both sides have to produce their documents, emails, meeting minutes, financial records, communications with counsel, everything relevant to the case under oath, under penalty of perjury. Diane Keller had spent 4 months crafting a public narrative. Discovery is where narratives go to die. The HOA was required to produce every document related to the bridge, going back to the subdivision's founding. Deeds, maintenance records, board meeting minutes, all communications with their attorney, all internal emails touching the subject, every piece of paper that existed. What came back was either damning or absent. Neither was good for them. The HOA attorney, the man who had sent that confident 3-page letter asserting a community easement corridor, had never conducted a title search on the bridge before sending it. Not a cursory search, not a partial search, no search at all. He had drafted a legal demand asserting property rights his client did not have, based entirely on Diane Keller's representation that the bridge was community property. He had taken her word for it and put his letterhead on it. That is not how property law works. That is not how any of this works. And in deposition under direct questioning from my attorney, he had no good answer for why it had happened. But the emails were worse. Internal HOA board emails produced under discovery showed that a board member, Greg, the retired accountant, had raised a concern in the very first week after I declined the right-of-way agreement. Greg had done his own digging. He had found the 1994 deed amendment. He had found the bridge transfer. He had written to Diane directly. I think we need to look at this more carefully before we proceed. The deed language is not what we assumed. Diane's response was 4 sentences. We have been using this bridge for 20 years. That establishes our rights, regardless of what some old deed says. Do not raise this at the board meeting, and don't put anything else in writing. She knew, she had known from the beginning, or close enough to the beginning, that it made no meaningful difference, that the legal foundation of her entire campaign was hollow. And she had made a deliberate choice to suppress that information and proceed anyway, to spend her community's money to defame me publicly, to authorize illegal surveillance, to file a bad faith cloud on my title. All of it with full knowledge that the bridge was not hers. The community necessity doctrine she had cited in her presentation to homeowners, the legal theory her attorney had summarized in his one-page handout, did not exist in our state statutes. My attorney searched case law going back 40 years. There was no precedent, no appellate ruling, no trial court decision. The HOA attorney in deposition could not cite a single case in any jurisdiction where this doctrine had been successfully applied to a bridge access dispute. When my attorney asked him directly where the doctrine came from, he said he had found a reference to it in a secondary legal commentary publication. Not a statute, not a case, a commentary. He had built a legal theory for a $160,000 community assessment on a footnote in a legal journal. The notice of interest was the final piece. In his deposition, the HOA attorney acknowledged that at the time of filing, he had not identified a specific legal instrument granting the HOA any interest in the property. He acknowledged that the standard for filing a notice of interest requires a good faith belief in an actual legal claim. He acknowledged that he had filed it in his own words to preserve options while the matter was being researched. My attorney looked at him across the table for a long moment. So you filed a document asserting a legal interest in my client's property before you had researched whether that interest existed. A pause. That is an accurate characterization. Yes, that admission was worth more than the sanctions we eventually collected. That was the moment the HOA's entire legal strategy collapsed in a single sentence. On a Tuesday morning in late March, 2 county sheriff's deputies drove to Diane Kilner's house, not to serve a civil summons, to conduct a criminal investigation interview. They had the photographs, the GPS coordinates, the serial number trace, the purchase records from the HOA management company's commercial account. They had everything I had given them organized and documented, and they had questions that required answers under the threat of criminal liability. The HOA management company's office received a visit the same morning. Purchasing records for the camera were subpoenaed. Employee interviews were scheduled. I wasn't there for any of it. I heard about it the same way most of the Ashford Pines community heard about it, through the neighborhood. In a subdivision of 200 homes, 2 sheriff's vehicles parked in front of the HOA president's house on a Tuesday morning is not something that goes unnoticed. By noon, every neighbor within 3 blocks knew. By evening, it was the only thing anyone in Ashford Pines was talking about. The HOA president was under criminal investigation for surveilling a neighbor's private property with equipment purchased on the HOA's account. Walt called me that afternoon. I was out on the property. Timber crew was on site doing the formal harvest assessment. First real step toward the sawmill lease. I had my boots in creek mud and a clipboard in my hand when the phone rang. "Marcus," he said, "Diane's car hasn't moved in 2 days." I thanked him and went back to work. That's the thing people sometimes don't understand about this kind of fight. The moments of vindication don't feel the way you expect them to. There's no surge or satisfaction, no release. You've been carrying the weight of it for so long that when pieces start falling away, you mostly just feel the absence of pressure. A slight lightening, and then you go back to what you came here to do in the first place. I had 1,500 acres of work waiting for me. I went back to it. The quiet title hearing was scheduled for a Thursday in April. Circuit Court, 2nd floor, Courtroom C. I had been in courtrooms before. Closings, a contract dispute years ago, a zoning appeal on a different parcel. But I had never sat at a plaintiff's table knowing that the outcome of the next 2 hours would determine whether the last 3 years of my professional life made sense or didn't. My attorney had submitted a 40-page brief. The HOA attorney had submitted 22 pages. The judge had read both. This was a summary judgment hearing, which meant no jury, just a circuit court judge, both counsels, and whatever remained of the HOA's legal argument, after 4 months of discovery, had finished with it. Diane was in the gallery, dark blazer. The same posture I remembered from the bridge, upright, composed, the physical language of someone who expects to be in charge of whatever room they're in. 2 board members sat beside her. Greg, the accountant who had tried to warn her, was not there. The HOA attorney looked like a man who had spent the previous week not sleeping well. My attorney presented the chain of title first, clean, linear, documented at every step. The 1991 logging company deed establishing the bridge as pertinent to the parcel. The 1994 amendment noting the transfer of bridge ownership following the county's decommissioning of road maintenance responsibility. The 1999 bankruptcy filing, and the transfer of the parcel and all its deed ordinances, including the bridge, to the creditor bank. Banks transferred to the failed Conservation Trust. The trust's reversion to the State Land Authority. The State Land Authority's auction, in which Marcus Hales submitted the only bid. 41 years of unbroken chain, every link documented, every transfer recorded at the county recorder's office. The HOA attorney argued equitable rights. He argued that 200 families had relied in good faith on this bridge for 20 years, that the community had invested in its maintenance, that requiring residents to use an 11-mile unpaved back road would constitute a severe hardship, that the court should recognize an implied easement based on necessity and long-standing use. He argued it well, actually, better than I expected, given what discovery had done to his foundation. He was working with what he had. The judge listened to all of it without interrupting. Then she took off her glasses and set them on the bench, and looked at the HOA attorney. "Counselor, I want to ask you a direct question. Is there any written instrument, a deed, a recorded easement, a recorded plat notation, anything in the public record that grants your client a legal interest in this bridge?" The HOA attorney paused just for a moment, but the pause was its own answer. "Not in recorded form, Your Honor. Our argument rests on implied easement by necessity, and the equitable doctrine of—" "I understand your argument," the judge said. "I'm asking about recorded instruments. Is there one?" "No, Your Honor." She nodded once, put her glasses back on. "Then we're going to talk about what the recorded instruments actually say." She ruled from the bench. Didn't take it under advisement. Didn't schedule a follow-up hearing. Ruled right there in courtroom C on a Thursday afternoon in April, while Diane Kellner sat completely still in the gallery. The bridge was my property. The quiet title motion was granted. The chain of title I had presented was accepted as complete and controlling. The notice of interest filed by the HOA attorney was ordered vacated and expunged from the public record immediately. And the HOA was sanctioned $4,200 for filing a document asserting a legal interest in property without a good faith factual basis for that claim. The HOA attorney said, "Thank you, Your Honor," in the tone of a man who wanted to be anywhere else on earth. I sat at the plaintiff's table and kept my face neutral. My attorney put his pen down and closed his folder. Behind us, I heard one of the board members exhale. Diane didn't make a sound. Court rulings in civil cases become public record the moment they're entered. By Friday morning, the judgment was on the county court's online docket. Case number, parties, outcome, sanctions. Anyone who knew where to look could find it in 4 clicks. Patricia knew where to look. She posted the full judgment in the Ashford Pines Facebook group at 7:14 on Friday morning, with a single line of text above it. "I think everyone should read this." By noon, she had added the discovery emails. They were part of the public court record, attached as exhibits to my attorney's summary judgment brief, filed months earlier, including the one from Diane Gregg, the one that said, "Don't put anything else in writing." The group fractured in real time. The homeowners who had voted yes on the $800 special assessment. People who had written checks. People who had trusted their president when she said this was a sure thing. People who had been told the legal foundation was solid were reading for the first time an email proving that Diane had known that foundation didn't exist before she ever called that meeting. $160,000 gone. Spent on litigation built on a lie authorized by a community that had been deliberately misled by the person they had elected to represent them. The comments went on for hours. Some were furious, some were heartbroken. A few were people who had voted no at the meeting, quietly saying they had tried to pump the brakes and been shouted down. Patricia wrote, "She told us this was a sure thing. She had emails proving she knew it wasn't." A petition for an emergency board meeting to remove Diane as president reached 112 signatures by Saturday evening. Diane's personal attorney, not the HOA attorney, her own newly retained personal attorney, advised her not to attend the board meeting. She didn't. The criminal investigation was still open. The defamation settlement was still being negotiated. But standing in my kitchen that Friday evening, reading through the Facebook thread on my phone, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time in connection with this land. Quiet. Just quiet. Diane Kellner resigned as HOA president on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the court ruling. The resignation letter was 4 sentences. It cited a desire to allow the community to focus on moving forward, and expressed gratitude for 9 years of service. No acknowledgement of what had happened. No apology to the homeowners whose money had funded a campaign she knew was built on nothing. No apology to me. I read it once and set it down. Some people, when they finally lose, find a way to learn something from it. And some people find a way to exit the room without ever quite admitting they were wrong. Diane was the second kind. I wasn't surprised. You don't spend 9 years ruling a 200-home subdivision by developing a strong capacity for self-reflection. The criminal investigation concluded 6 weeks after the quiet title ruling. The county sheriff's office presented its findings to the district attorney. The DA reviewed the evidence, the camera, the purchase records, the GPS documentation, the installation on my private property without consent, and filed charges. Diane was cited under the state's unlawful surveillance statute, Class D felony. Her personal attorney negotiated a plea to a reduced charge, criminal mischief, before it reached trial. The sentence, 18 months of unsupervised probation, a $3,500 fine, and 100 hours of community service. It wasn't prison. I want to be honest about that. Some people hear this story and want a more dramatic ending. Handcuffs, a perwalk, something cinematic. That's not what happened. What happened was a woman in her late 50s, with no prior record, negotiated a plea that kept her out of a courtroom and off a jury's radar. The system worked exactly the way it usually works for first-time offenders with good attorneys. But here's what the plea meant in practical terms. It meant Diane Kellner had a criminal record. It meant that anyone who ever Googled her name in connection with a future HOA board position, a real estate transaction, a professional reference, would find it. It meant the thing she had done, surveilling a neighbor's private property to gain leverage in a dispute she knew she couldn't win legally, was now permanently publicly documented as a crime. The civil defamation case settled out of court 8 weeks after the criminal plea. The terms were confidential. What I can tell you is that my attorney used the word meaningful when he called to tell me it was done. And my attorney is not a man who uses that word casually. The HOA's insurance carrier paid the majority of the settlement. Then they canceled the HOA's policy. The new board, Patricia as interim president, 2 newly elected members who had both voted no on the special assessment, immediately voted to dissolve the contract with the HOA management company, the same company whose commercial account had been used to purchase the surveillance camera. They commissioned an independent audit of the last 4 years of HOA finances. The audit found irregularities, not small ones. I won't go into detail because those proceedings are still ongoing, and they're not my story to tell. But I will say that the $160,000 spent on bridge litigation turned out to be only one of several things the new board wished they had looked at sooner. The $160,000 itself was not recovered. The homeowners who had paid the special assessment did not get their money back. That was perhaps the hardest consequence. Not for Diane, who had already moved on to her next chapter, but for the people who had trusted her. The families who had written $800 checks because their president told them it was necessary. They paid for a lie and had nothing to show for it. That's the real cost of following a leader who substitutes confidence for competence. About a month after the quiet title ruling, I called Patricia and asked if she and the new board had time to meet. We sat at a folding table in the Ashford Pines community room, the same room where Diane had stood 4 months earlier and told 200 families I was extorting them. Patricia brought coffee. The 2 new board members brought legal pads. Nobody brought a pre-drafted agreement with my name already on the signature line. I want to be honest about what I could have done at that point. I held the deed to the only practical bridge connecting Ashford Pines to the county highway. I had just won every legal action filed in connection with that bridge. I had a defamation settlement in my pocket and a criminal plea on record. The leverage I held in that room was about as complete as leverage gets in a property dispute. I could have installed the gate. I could have charged a toll. I could have offered a right-of-way agreement at a price that reflected 4 months of legal fees and personal aggravation and a clouded title and a threatened loan and a surveillance camera pointed at my land. I didn't do any of that. What I offered was a recorded easement, permanent residential access rights for Ashford Pines' homeowners across the bridge and the approach road in exchange for a one-time payment of $18,500. That payment would fund a professional structural assessment of the bridge. Because it was 30 years old and nobody had ever formally evaluated its load capacity, and seed a 10-year maintenance reserve account held in the HOA's name, I would hold the deed. They would fund the upkeep. Both parties would sign. Both parties would record. A real agreement between 2 parties who both understood exactly what they were signing. Patricia looked at the number for a moment. Then she looked at me. I want you to know, she said, that most of us never wanted this fight. I believed her. I had believed it for a while. I know, I said. That's why you're getting a real agreement instead of a gate. The board voted to approve it unanimously that afternoon. The easement was drafted, reviewed by both sides' attorneys, and recorded at the county recorder's office within 3 weeks. Clean, legal, permanent, the way you could have been from the very first morning, if someone had simply knocked on my door and asked. By early summer, the land was working. The timber crews had been completed by February. 340 acres of marketable hardwood identified. A sustainable 25-year rotation plan developed with a forestry consultant. I signed a harvest lease with a regional sawmill co-op in March. First cuts scheduled for the following fall. The income projections were conservative, real, and exactly what my loan performance clause needed to see. The hunting leases filled faster than I expected. Whitetail mostly, with a few turkey hunters who had heard about the creek bottom through the kind of word of mouth that moves quietly through hunting communities. The old quarry pond was producing mallards, wood ducks, a pair of Canada geese that showed up in October and apparently decided to stay. 2 of my first-year clients asked about waterfowl blinds for the following season before the first season was even over. The conservation easement came through in June. 600 acres of the western portion of the parcel enrolled in the state's Wildlife Corridor program. Permanent protection, DNR partnership, a trail easement that connected my land to the adjacent wilderness preserve and extended an existing public hiking route by nearly 4 miles. The tax benefit was significant. The paperwork was extensive. It was worth every page. My private lender called in July. He had been watching the parcel come together, the lease agreements, the easement recording, the DNR partnership documentation. I had copied him on as a courtesy. He offered a refinance at a deal rate, a full point below my original terms, and extended the performance clause by 18 months, which at that point I no longer needed. I refinanced anyway. Good terms are good terms. On a morning in late August, I drove out to the property before dawn, parked at the bridge, sat there with the windows down while the sky went from black to gray to the particular pale gold that comes just before the sun clears the tree line. Rich Creek was running higher than it had been in November, the first time I'd stood on this branch as its owner. The boards were solid underfoot when I got out and walked to the center railing. The structural assessment, completed 2 months earlier, funded by the HOA's easement payment, had rated the bridge at a 40,000-pound load capacity, better than either of us had expected. It was built to last. I stood there and listened to the water and looked at 1,500 acres of quietly working land and thought about what it had taken to get here. Not the legal strategy, not the documents or the depositions or the courtroom, just the raw fact of having stood in this exact spot on a bridge I had bought because I had read one paragraph that everyone else had missed and refused to move. People ask me sometimes what I would have done differently. Honestly, not much. I would have hired the attorney earlier, not to file sooner, but to have counsel in place before the first certified letter arrived, so there was no gap between receiving a legal threat and having a legal response ready. That's a tactical adjustment, not a regret. The rest of it, I do the same way. The 6 months of research before the bid, the decision to photograph the right-of-way agreement instead of signing it, the patience to let Diane's campaign build its own evidence before I responded, the choice to file everything at once rather than piecemeal, the decision, at the end of it, to offer a fair easement instead of a gate. It cost me $34,000 in legal fees, 4 months of the specific kind of stress that lives in your chest and wakes you up at 3 in the morning doing math. One friendship, Walt, that went cold for almost 6 months before he showed up at my property one Saturday morning with a surveying question and a thermos of coffee, and we both pretended the distance hadn't happened. Walt testified in the defamation case for the record, submitted a written statement about the variance threat Diane had used to pressure him into backing away. It wasn't required. I hadn't asked him for it. He did it because he felt it was right. That meant more to me than most of what happened in that courtroom. What this experience built beyond the land, beyond the lien, beyond the legal victory, was a clarity I didn't have before about what it means to know what you own. Not just the deed, the history of it, the value of it, the legal architecture surrounding it. Most people buy property the way they buy appliances. They check the basics. They sign what's put in front of them. They assume the rest will sort itself out. The rest does not always sort itself out. Diane Keller didn't create this dispute out of malice, exactly. She created it out of assumption. The assumption that 20 years of use was the same as 20 years of ownership. The assumption that an outsider with a deed would eventually yield to an organized community with a lawyer. The assumption that confidence was a substitute for documentation. It isn't. It never is. Know what you own. Read the paragraph everyone else skipped. And when someone shows up on your property with a clipboard and a pre-signed agreement and tells you that you don't understand what you're dealing with, read it, photograph it, hand it back, then go home and call your attorney. If you've ever had an HOA, a neighbor, or an institution try to take something from you, something you researched, something you earned, something that was legally and rightfully yours, drop your story in the comments. I read every single one. And if this one hit close to home, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you in the next one.